Hello, the title of this lecture is Reaganomics. In the early summer of 1980, President Jimmy Carter was quietly confident about winning a second term in office. One Carter advantage was the media. Most reporters were liberal Democrats. It also pleased Carter that Ronald Reagan was his opponent. He stated that, quote, all my political team believed that he was the weakest candidate the Republicans could have chosen. Carter looked forward to challenging the 69-year-old former actor and his theory of enormous tax cuts and other proposals, which Carter said defied economic logic. The progressive magazine Nation wrote of Reagan's radicalism and of Republicans determined to commit political suicide. James Reston of the New York Times was another who thought the choice of Reagan was a gift to Democrats. Quote, seldom in the history of American politics has a party out of power shown so much generosity to a president in so much difficulty. As it turned out, Reagan's critics were wrong about his political fortunes. They had no clue that his economic policies would be wildly successful in the eyes of many Americans in the 1980s. Carter's economic policies were a disaster. With many Keynesians guiding his presidency, Carter's failure was a major blow to the psyche of Democrats who expected the experts to revive Keynesianism and propel America to better economic fortunes. Keynesianism stumbled in academic circles, but its fall as economic policy was especially brutal. During the Carter years, ordinary Americans experienced hardship as they adapted to employment setbacks and as they paid higher taxes. Former Treasury Secretary William Simon described the modern Keynesian mindset as one that experienced a drastic change since FDR's days. Quote, today our state is simply a redistributionist machine run amok. The political curse of the era is the coercive egalitarianism that sought to level all people in the hope of creating a better humanitarian society. For some, it was a noble goal, but it brought more misery than prosperity to America. Certainly, Americans had a clear choice when they voted on November 4th, 1980. As Carter declared at the Democratic Convention 3 months before the election, quote, this election is a stark choice between two men, two parties, two sharply different pictures of America and the world. But it is more than that. It is a choice between two futures. As the election neared, Reagan asked a San Diego crowd, quote, are you more confident that our economy will create productive work for our society, or are you less confident? Do you feel you can keep the job you have or gain a job if you don't have one? Citing actual numbers, Reagan asked again, are you satisfied that inflation at the highest rate in 33 years were the best that we could do? Are interest rates at 14.5% something you are prepared to live with? There were many other issues for voters to consider, but the economy was the #1 concern for countless Americans. On election day, exit polls showed that the economy was the most important issue for most voters. The popular vote was Reagan 51.6%, Carter 41.7%, and independent John Anderson 6.7%. The electoral college vote was 489 for Reagan and a devastating low 49 for Carter. In addition, Republicans gained 12 Senate seats, winning their first majority since the 1950 election. When Reagan took office in January 1981, Republicans believed there were good reasons to support his economic policies. What became known as Reaganomics was primarily the cutting of taxes, the capping of government spending in many areas, but not the military, and the reduction of government regulations. The themes of liberty, initiative, and optimism were a part of the Reaganomic package. The lowering of taxes received the most attention. According to Republicans, a bad idea was Democrats' insistence to raise taxes on the rich. Philosopher Michael Novak argued that activists overestimated both the numbers and the income of the rich. The total adjusted gross income of Americans who earned more than 1 million in the year 1982 was 17.6 billion. When government taxes took about half of the sum, there was enough to keep the federal government going for about 3 days. Put another way, confiscation of all the money earned by millionaires and billionaires paid the government's bills for about 6 days. Rhetoric against the rich might win political capital with the American left, but the revenue gained by raising taxes on the rich would be far short of what the government needed. Many Americans were willing to give Reagan a chance to fix the economy. The signing into law of the Economic Recovery Act of 1981 represented the largest tax cut in American history. The Economic Recovery Act immediately reduced the top marginal personal income tax rates by 20%. So it was at 70 and it dropped down to 50. But also this act phased in a 23% accumulative decrease in personal income tax rates over the next 3 years. So there would be further reductions. As the Wall Street Journal editorialized, it was, quote, a spectacular tax victory. Another significant episode in 1981 was Reagan's response to the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization strike, the acronym being PATCO. Representing 12,000 members, PATCO sought reduced workloads, higher wages, and modernization of the air traffic control system. The problem was that PATCO workers were public employees of the Federal Aviation Administration who took an oath not to strike against the federal government. Reagan dismissed virtually all air traffic controllers, even though PATCO had been one of the few unions which supported his bid for the presidency. It was a daring stand. He had to consider the political risk in the event there was an airplane crash while the air traffic control system experienced understaffing due to the strike. Fortunately, there were no crashes, and Reagan's bold action, viewed by unions as an effort to break union power, was a symbolic and lasting victory, notably since moderated wage demands were often the rule throughout the 1980s. No less important was the optimistic response of the business community, including many leading European financiers who explained that Reagan's resolve inspired their trust and confidence to invest in America. Also in 1981, Reagan ended the price controls on oil, and the results were an increase of oil supplies and the eventual decline of gasoline prices, even below price control levels. However, Reagan understood it would take time for his economic policies to turn the American economy around. Conservatives like William F. Buckley Jr. feared that Reaganomics did not go far enough with budget cuts. From the left, Alan Wolf of the progressive magazine Nation wrote how conservatives lived in a fantasy world, and Reagan was clueless about the economy. Another progressive writing in the Social Work Journal predicted that Reaganomics set the American people on a course that will divide them into a nation that consists of the very rich, the working poor, and the unemployed. Recession, high unemployment, and high interest rates were the reality of 1982, but the following years showed greater promise. By summer 1983, impressive job creation numbers, high levels of housing starts, and a rising Dow Jones Industrial Average reflected the sunnier mood of an increasing number of Americans. In October 1983, Reagan told Americans that contrary to the doom and gloom preaching of experts, the United States was experiencing more prosperous times. Rather than taking credit, Reagan thanked the American people. Believe me, it wasn't Washington experts who said government is too big, taxes are too high. That was your message. You made reforms possible. Many Americans disagreed with those who said Reagan's economic policies were mainly for the very rich. The economic recovery was real and broad. Reagan's policy provided to be far more successful than the Keynesian and socialist-leaning models promoted by liberal left intellectuals. The improvement in the national economy in Reagan's first term was significant. Inflation was down from double figures to 4.6. And unemployment and interest rates had dropped significantly. In 1984, American voters could stay with Reagan or go with Democrat Walter Mondale, who was clearly a New Deal Democrat. Well, voters had their say. Reagan took 49 states. The Electoral College vote was 525 for Reagan, 13 for Mondale. Reagan's economic success continued, but liberals argued that tax cuts for the rich caused record federal deficits. Although many conservatives were unhappy about the budget deficits, they believed the problem was government spending rather than the tax cuts. Contrary to criticism, the Reagan government collected more tax revenues each year than in any year of any previous administration in history. And in addition to the increase in federal revenues, there were the state and local revenues, which grew from $506 billion in 1981 to $842 billion in 1987. So supply side economists pointed to the insightfulness of the Laffer curve. To the surprise of some, Reagan's tax reforms actually shifted the weight of federal income tax to the very rich. In 1979, the wealthiest 5% of Americans paid 37.6% of all federal income taxes. But in 1987, the top 5% paid 43%. Conservatives pointed to positive signs in minority communities, including economic gains by middle-class African Americans. For the 80s, census information showed a 10% rise in the proportion of Blacks employed in professional and middle-class jobs. Liberals argued that Reaganomics caused a growing income disparity between African Americans and whites, but official reports from the Census Bureau provided no evidence of a growing disparity. The rate of white-Black earnings kept in pace. In 1977 and 1987, African Americans earned 57% as much as whites. Where there was a growing gap was between the poor and the middle class, but this was more due to the shift in marriage patterns, according to Michael Novak. By the 1980s, male householders were far more scarce in the lowest quintile, and female householders not participating in the labor force became more predominant. Young, Black, single, unemployed mothers hardly affected by economic growth, since they participate in the labor economy hardly at all. Although the economic plight of poor Blacks was real and the adjustment to a new job market was very difficult for some, the total annual personal income of African Americans rose from $191 billion in 1980 to $259 billion in 1988. And these are calculated in 1988 dollars. The improved income figures of African-American married coupled families were encouraging. Columnist Cortland Milloy wrote that the economic improvement of African-Americans was, quote, one of the nation's greatest success stories. When examining economic conditions in America, there is a strong temptation to fit people into the simple categories of poor and rich without doing justice to the fact that typically only 2% of the American population remain poor. In numerous ways, America set a high mark for standard of living. People throughout the world marveled at its wealth. Data indicated that the Reagan years were especially impressive. The so-called misery index, which is the sum of inflation and employment rates, fell by over 50% from the Carter years. And other data gave Reagan the best economic report card of any president since Harry Truman. Another number stood out. Beginning in November 1982, the American economy expanded for 92 months, experienced a small recession, and then continued on its way to, quote, a wholly unprecedented 10-year expansion that ultimately became the longest in all of U.S. history. This great expansion and Reagan's earlier victory over great inflation were two inspiring realities. His worst critics gave him little or no credit, but historian Robert Collins writes that the fact that the U.S. economy performed in so stellar a fashion for so long after the changes he initiated went into effect, at the very least, calls into question those contemporary critics who asserted he was single-handedly wrecking the economy. Economic comparisons between the American experience and what took place in other parts of the world also mattered. If work for ordinary Americans was to be more than an unpleasant task of physical existence, there had to be a better appreciation of what America offered compared to socialist-leaning nations. Michael Novak who I mentioned earlier, wrote prolifically throughout the Reagan era on the free market and socialism. In 1990, he reflected on the economic and political changes that America witnessed in the 1980s. Novak became certain that democratic capitalism offered the best system to raise up the poor, and he made his mark early by violating, quote, a gentleman's agreement among educated humanists to say little except evil about capitalism and to notice little about socialism except its ideals, end of quote. Novak went farther than many defenders of capitalism. In addition to arguing that the success of democracy depended on a capitalist economy, he maintained that beyond a pragmatic case for capitalism, there was also a moral defense. Superior to traditionalist or socialist societies, quote, democratic capitalism reflects the image of the creator in humans, their own inventiveness, imagination, creativity. By fostering a sense of cooperation, attentiveness to customers, openness to strangers, and alert curiosity, capitalism imposed a rather high moral discipline. Critics echoing Marx might argue that the impulse of the free market was solely materialistic, but Novak wrote that if that was the case, the capitalist system, quote, would have long since fallen into narcissism, hedonism, and death. Capitalism continued to reinvigorate itself, always inspiring creativity. More than just private property, markets, and profits, capitalism was also invention. The economic record of socialism, on the other hand, was grim. After decades of living with socialism, Novak argued, Eastern Europeans were well aware of the powerful and corrupting influences of socialist morality, confirmed in the disregard for truth, the unquestioning subservience to the ruling elite, the promotion of envy by the rhetorical slogans of equality and social justice, and the deadening of initiative and self and respect for self. Released from an onerous economic dependency, they were ready to choose the free market rather than some third way between capitalism and socialism. The linkage of capitalism and foreign policy was also obvious. Concerning foreign policy, the Iran-Contra affair significantly hurt Reagan. Yet, whereas liberal figures lamented Reagan's Manichaean worldview, so-called Manichaean worldview, which saw Soviet socialism as evil and capitalism, American capitalism as good, many Americans gave Reagan the benefit of the doubt for his efforts to fight global revolutionary socialism. The Reagan administration produced large deficits, but much of the spending was on the military so that the United States could take a strong stand against socialist regimes throughout the world. History demonstrated that governments during the Cold War adopting a command economy often saw very different results from ones favoring a freer market strategy. Reagan supporters pointed out that before 1980, only 1/3 of Latin Americans lived under civilian democratic rule, whereas 90% did so by the end of Reagan's presidency. And with the ending of the Cold War, the United States reduced military spending, and by the end of the 20th century, only 3% of the gross domestic product went to military spending. And this is the lowest since 1941. The only serious economic mishap of the Reagan years was over in a number of weeks. On October 19, 1987, Americans witnessed Black Monday. The New York Times front page the following day asked, does 1987 equal 1929? The crash saw the Dow Jones Industrial fall a stunning 500 points in one day. The August high was 2,722, and the October low was 1,738, a total fall of 36%. There was a loss of almost $1 trillion of American stocks. But the crisis lasted less than 3 months. Remarkably, no depression or even recession followed. And within 1 year, the Dow returned to its pre-crash high. Democrats attacked the Reagan administration for not taking action in the manner of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Reagan instead took President Calvin Coolidge as his model. Reagan let the economy recover without government intervention, and thus, according to economist Thomas Sowell, ushered in a long period of high employment and low interest. Reagan's popularity grew. Home ownership rates either remained steady or climbed, spending on leisure and recreation increased, and retail sales, adjusted for inflation, rose by a third in the 1980 to 1988 period. Americans championed the creativity and productivity that played out in many industries. Remarkable advances were with computer technology as the information revolution unfolded quickly throughout the 1980s. In the 1970s, late 1970s, Bill Gates and Paul Allen, two young nerds who formed Microsoft, later one word, began developing programming systems for microcomputers. Elsewhere, Stephen Wozniak and Steve Jobs built computers and named their company Apple. In the 1980s, IBM turned to Gates' Microsoft for the operating system of its IBM personal computer. Gates and Jobs became household names. Technology raced ahead in free market America, and an increasing number of Americans began using computers at home, school, and work. Over 1/3 of working adults used a computer at work by 1989. In 1988, a Harvard Business School scholar marveled that, quote, there is hardly a segment of the US economy that is not penetrated by some form of computer-based technology. The impact of computers was astounding. It is no exaggeration to say, Richard Collins writes, that in the 1980s and early 1990s, the United States moved from the industrial age to the information age. On November 8, 1988, the American people went to the polls and gave their verdict on Reaganomics. Republican George H.W. Bush won handily over Democratic Michael Dukakis. The last time there were 3 full successive Republican administrations was 1921 to 1933 period. Bush clearly benefit from the success of Reaganomics. Between 1980 and 1988, approximately 2 million old industry jobs did disappear in the United States, but dwarfing this number were the 18 million jobs created in the rapidly growing sectors of retail and real estate sales, new technologies, finance, and insurance. Lower taxes, deregulation, and renewed optimism resulted in a proliferation of new businesses and a steady advance of American living standards. Whereas incomes declined in the 1970s, the real income of Americans at every level increased in the 1980s. Those who earned above $29,000 in 1980 comprised 20% of Americans. At the end of Reagan's presidency, the number, measured in constant $1988, rose to a phenomenal 38%. From 1980 to 1988, inflation dropped from 12.5 to 4.4%, and civilian unemployment from 7.1 to 5.5%. Lower inflation improved everyone's lot. Interest rates dropped from the 21% of 1980 to under 10%. Simply put, the years 1983 to 1989 represented, quote, the biggest peacetime economic boom in U.S. history. As for the gross national product, it rose in constant dollars from 2.7 trillion in 1980 to 5 trillion in 1989. There was much praise for Reaganomics and the benefits of stable growth and greater employment. In the words of one Reagan biographer, these years saw, quote, the greatest outpouring of private generosity in history. Contrast to the economic suffering in various socialist countries, few Americans worried about the essentials of food, adequate shelter, and clothing. During the government's war on poverty in the 1960s and early 1970s, there were many urban ghetto riots. Reagan rejected the big government approach of solving poverty, and major urban riots became virtually extinct in the 1980s. For the first time in years, Americans expressed confidence in the direction of the nation and excitement over the signs of revolutionary socialist collapse in Europe and other key regions of the world. However, the Republicans failed to win a fourth straight term. Some argue that President Bush strayed from the Reagan path and sided with the strategy of balance the budget at all costs. His raising of taxes, despite his promise, read my lips, no new taxes, was a major error, economically and also politically. In November 1992, he lost the election to Democrat Bill Clinton. However, Clinton did not return to the level of Keynesianism of early Democratic administration. The pro-market policy of lower taxes and deregulation continued into the 1980s. There were some adjustments with taxes, but there was also sort of a continuum. Although Clinton raised the top marginal income tax to 40%, it was still lower than what had been at the first stage of the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981. As one economic commentator wrote, quote, Clinton stood on Reagan's shoulders. Real GDP growth averaged 3.9%, and employment increased by 23% from 1993 through 2000. Given the head of steam Reagan gave the 1990s, plus the fall of the Soviet Union and the internet boom and declining energy prices, it may have been impossible to mess up the decade. End of quote. Thank you.